Millions of buyers are sitting on the real estate fence because they're waiting for the market to turn their way. But at the end of the day, you're ready to buy a house when you're ready to buy a house. When your walls are closing in on your growing family, or when the house is too big because your kids have moved out. When you're sick of paying someone else's mortgage, or when it's time to retire somewhere new. Buyers can't wait for a market shift. They need a clear path forward and wisdom from real people. That's where How to Buy comes in. You'll join me, Leo Ansoliaga, as we hear how to buy stories and advice from real buyers and the professionals who help them along the way in mortgage, real estate, insurance, financial planning, contracting, appraisal, and so much more. Now, let's jump in to today's episode. In this episode of How to Buy, I'm joined with Matt Grieb, a certified financial planner and a trusted advisor in the DC metropolitan area. In this conversation, we dive into Matt's personal journey into the world of financial advising, the lessons he's learned along the way, and the unique perspective he brings when helping people navigate their biggest financial decisions. I hope you enjoy. Well, I have a very special treat today. I actually hinted about this guy in my most recent LinkedIn post. You know, there's not a lot of people that get me to write things down when they quote something, but Matt Grieb did that just recently. He's a financial advisor, CFP, in the DC metropolitan area, someone that is well respected, regarded by his clients, colleagues. And today we're going to talk a little bit about his journey, his story, in his particular practice, but also how does a financial advisor usually give advice, as it relates to probably the biggest investment that someone's going to make in their lifetime. Matt, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Leo. I appreciate it. And I know we've talked a lot off camera, so now we get to put it on camera today.
I'm excited. Well, Matt, nobody wakes up on a Saturday morning and says, I'm going to be a financial advisor, right? So I guess before we get going, tell us a little bit about your journey, right? Like, how did this entire thing begin? How did your professional journey begin? And how did you get started in the financial advisor sector?
Sure. So I'm my parents' first financial advisor. So my family did not grow up with one. But there was a good friend and teammate whose dad in my high school who was an advisor. And I just loved his persona. It seemed like he was available. And I really looked up to him. He was a good mentor for me to help get me, started, like, who should I talk to? But then ultimately, through high school, college, and then early professional career, I said, I want to be a financial advisor. What can I do to position myself in that way? How much can I learn, and how can I do it as soon as humanly possible? So I slowly but surely finally got into the industry. Now they make it a little more accommodative with some of the rule changes for getting series license, but started RBC Wealth Management, went to Janney Montgomery Scott, and I was working for other people at those firms, doing well, but really from day one had mentors and other people that I leaned on to say, hey, if I want to be my advisor one day, how do I position myself? Mm-hmm. And so I was bringing on clients, but, was kind of hitting the ceiling with the advisors that I was working with, which was fine. But fortunately, took my clients that I had, moved over to Raymond James in 2018, and it's been amazing ever since. And unfortunately, now I can never have a boss, Leo, other than my family. I'm going to be on my own. So I'm very fortunate. That's a bit of my journey. But, my clients now, it's really private wealth, ultra high net worth clients. 70% of my clients own a business of some kind. We're in about 15 or 16 states. I'm on a plane from time to time. So I'm very lucky to have the client base that I have. But it took a lot of, sweat, equity, luck, whatnot. That's very happy to share. And fortunately, I think a lot of the symmetry, talk about a journey, and I know we're going to talk a lot about paths and over this conversation here that, for my clients, they're often first generation wealth. They started a business or something happened in their life where they really have to worry about it from a planning standpoint. And so it's easy for me to communicate with them, from a similar standpoint of, my dad worked for the government, my mom worked in nonprofit, right? So
Mm.
I had to figure out a lot of, the greater financial world on my own and through a lot of mentors and reading as much as I could. So that's a bit about my journey.
Yeah, and what a great, tie-in to, the people that you're now serving, right? I mean, a lot of people say that going into business, right? There's no ceiling, but there's also no floor. All right.
Right.
And I think a lot of people forget that, right? And business owners specifically know this really well, right? Like the potential, for upside is great, but man, God forbid something happens, and we end up in the basement, right? And I think it's critical, like you said, to align yourself with people that are going to not just give you advice, but are going to earn your trust in the process, earn your trust in solving the pain points that you have, and most importantly, organizing, this particular side of the balance sheet, right, which is the asset side of the balance sheet, right? So, talk a little bit about, a traditional client that you serve. Obviously, you said, financial. Your practice serves mostly business owners, but talk a little bit about in terms of how you advise your clients in terms of the overall arching, of not just saving money, but having obviously assets well diversified. You know, just for the record, we're not giving, financial advice here, but just I want to understand a little bit of your overall practice.
Sure. No, I appreciate that. I would say this, that everything has to start with the foundation first. And my analogy is for a lot of my clients, imagine if you walked to a doctor's office and they said, oh, Matt, you have to take Lipitor. Everyone takes Lipitor. You need to take it, right? And
Mm,
that's the way a lot of people receive financial advice. Doesn't matter whether they're buying a home or mortgage or renting or this investment or insurance, whatever it may be. You need to sell your business this way or do that way.
mm,
And really, my whole thing is you have to have a test. You have to have a health assessment, right?
mm,
You have to go through the diagnosis before you can write the prescription, right?
mhm,
And that's ultimately what I think of for financial planning first and foremost, that if someone comes to me with a check, it's very hard to give real long-term advice until I know their full picture. Okay.
mhm,
In the same way, in your world, right? If someone's trying to buy a home, it's like, well, how much home can you afford, right? You have to go through the process. So
mm,
with a lot of my clients, they're balancing a lot of things, whether they're in the medical field or technology, or there's a lot of government contract in the greater DC area, or they're, a widget maker in Texas. That first and foremost, we have to organize, as you said, develop a financial plan, understand how can they position themselves and their families as best they possibly can from an investment standpoint, exit planning standpoint, generational wealth standpoint, tax considerations, with the accountant, the estate attorney. All those pieces have to go into it before I say, this is how or where we're going to allocate your money. And if
mm,
you understand all those components, then you can give real advice as opposed to force feeding a client into, just your way of the world. I don't
mhm,
have to do that. And I think that that type of messaging is clear and it's easy to add value in that way,
mm,
because everyone does financial planning. But if you can think with the next decade or 2 decades, then all of a sudden you're not worried about getting someone to the altar, right? You can
mm,
be brutally honest and work them through what's the next step in your business? What's the next step to retire? What's the next step to transition wealth to the next generation or skip a generation,
mm.
right? So that's all part of the process, but we never start with the end in mind of saying, how can I make this person a client? I'm giving the advice, giving the planning first, and then ultimately developing that relationship. The word trust, as you said before.
Yeah, and that's just such a great point because, oftentimes people forget that advice really does boil down to guidance, right? Well, how can we guide you in the correct direction if we don't know what your ultimate goals are? If we don't know perhaps some of the blind spots that you have? How can we guide you if we don't understand, the full picture of what you're looking to do, right? But also, I mean, how can we guide you, in other areas perhaps, of the actual the overall picture in terms of wealth, right? So one of the things that makes us unique as a practice is that we partner with advisors just like you, right? To become a neutral party, right? And advisors, right? To people that are thinking about buying real estate. You see, and you and I have talked a little bit about this in detail, but most people think that a mortgage is simply just a payment and a rate and a cash to close. It's not. It's one slice of your overall financial picture that most times your advisor is going to put together, right? And so as a financial advisor, like how do you typically advise clients on how the mortgage fits into their broader financial goals, right? Like retirement planning or investment. Like what kind of advice or what kind of directive or what kind of like suggestions do you give to clients as it relates to this side of the balance sheet?
Sure. Well, first I'll say it's easy to partner with, good mortgage teams and, similar to yours. And we've talked about clients before, that really we are not in the mortgage business. So I just want what's best for my clients. That's the fiduciary standard, right? And ultimately, I would say my advice never boils down to just personal preferences. It's of the moment, right? And
Mm,
so let's just say, in the late 2010s and the early 2020s, we were begging people to take as big a mortgage as humanly possible because rates were so low, right?
mm,
It's just even, you could have almost gotten money market rates and just offset your mortgage, okay?
mm,
Versus, obviously rates have come up a little bit. I know they touched over 7 and now we're in a more reasonable range, which is actually average. It's
mm,
not, it's high relative to the last decade, but it's actually average over generations of time. So it's really of the moment. And again, it always starts with the baseline first, which is don't start with the white picket fence and the nice neighborhood, which is usually how, everyone searches online. But when it comes to me, say, well, what house can we afford? How much mortgage can we take on? How should we take a mortgage?
mm,
Is to say, well, how much can you afford on a monthly basis? That's first and foremost. Second of all, what's the rate? How does this fit into your debt profile, right? If
mm,
I'm a small business owner, I may have certain liens or obligations that I have to consider. If I'm in
mm,
government contracting, there's certain pros and cons to your primary real estate.
mm,
If I'm trying to grow my business, how am I going to go about that? Right. We have a lot of clients who have, whether it's a mortgage, security based line of credit, debt instruments, right, to help create that liquidity or the next project without taking on, equity partners. That's obviously a big piece of what we talk about. But I never stick to it just as you pointed out, like, well, the rate is this
mhm,
because the liquidity could be a lot worth a lot more, right? And we have clients that have bought other businesses that
mhm,
needed the cash. So they should have taken the mortgage because after, the deal goes through, they're going to grow at double digits percentages from their business operation or perhaps some of their investments. And yet they're, locked in that rate, which they can ultimately refinance later on. So it's very of the moment. I know your team does a good job of emphasizing that and talking that through where, personal preference, if all things are equal, I like reducing risk. That's why I like fixed mortgages. But there's certainly a place for the SBLs, the loans of the world, the arms of the world, because of the environment that we're in, and that if there's enough fluctuation, you can always refinance. But I never set it and forget it, so to speak. But you have
mm.
to leverage debt when you can, because ultimately the higher net worth families, they don't necessarily have to sell or they don't have to take on equity partners to create that liquidity that they want.
Yeah, and I think, what great advice that you bring forward because, you know, I think ultimately what you're saying is that this is really a bespoke process, right? Tied to you specifically, right? What is your story? What are your needs? And what are some of the, problems that, we can solve in that journey, right? Now, I think it goes without saying, and I think we want to make sure we cement this, right? You want to work with whom you feel most comfortable with, right? I think every practice, every organization out there in terms of the mortgage business, have different, different things that they offer that perhaps other people don't offer. So ultimately, it's not just Leo and his firm, right? It's the right party for you, right? But
Mhm.
aside from that, it also boils down to, okay, what is the right mortgage product, not just for the now, but for the next 5 to 8 years, 9 to 14? And how does this the entire thing blend within your overall financial strategy? Now, it's interesting to me, right? Like advice to some extent is available, readily available out there, but yet, man, people are hesitant, right, to engage someone like you, right? They will go online, like you say, and look at the white picket fence, right? And then call, their dad or their dad's advisor and say, hey, I'm thinking about investing in real estate. But why do you suppose that it's so intimidating for people, to come and talk to you? I mean, I bet there's, a good amount of business owners that perhaps right now could utilize your services in terms of the problems that they're dealing with, but yet they're nervous about coming to you. What would you say to those business owners that perhaps haven't really taken the step to engage?
Sure. Well, I could fill up the book on this, and that's why we get lunch. But I'll try to be as succinct as I possibly can. Which is the first thing that I tease my friends in the real estate industry, which is that they are dating their mortgage lender or their realtor, but they're marrying the home. Okay, and in my world, they are dating the investments, but they're marrying their advisor.
Mm,
Okay, and this is just a statistical fact. The average age in my industry is probably a 60-year-old male financial advisor, right? So that is going to change in the next 10 to 15 years as that generation moves through and retires. That you may have had that advisor for 30 years, but
mm,
now you better be in love with whoever the number two is or the co-partners, okay? Because that's really who you're going to be dealing with, or your spouse or your kids or your grandkids are going to be dealing with, right? And so one of my disadvantages 12 years ago is now my biggest advantage, which is that I'm not going anywhere. I've got two kids, and I've got to pay for plenty of schooling and whatnot. That consistency is now a huge advantage for me. It's a huge advantage for my clients, right?
mm,
Because we've successfully gotten owners or families to the finish line, whether that be exiting, whether that be retiring, whether that be transitioning assets. But also now you don't have to change for the next 3 or 4 decades with the same person. That's a pretty powerful tool. That's number
mm,
one. Number two is, I think, even though you can search online for answers, the problem is once you start begin to trust someone, whatever form that takes,
mm,
it is, or some people feel bad, and it may be a reflection on themselves. And what I would say is, I can look at a statement and see whether an advisor is treating someone like a number or like an individual. And usually that happens through scale and where assets are positioned. Because I look at some statements and I have clients that are making $1 million a year and they have bonds in the wrong place. And advisors call it total return, right? Because it's easier for the advisor to put Matt and Natalie in the same risk tolerance all the way through all the accounts. Well, that makes it
mm,
easier for your advisor, but that doesn't make any sense for a client that owns a business who's making serious income or trying
mm,
to transition assets or worried about estate tax. It
mm,
makes no sense. Because what happens if you pass away early? Do you want higher or lower RMDs? Do you want to control your situation more? Right. And so it's harder to operate it in the way that we do. But to your point, whether it's bespoke or everyone uses the word custom, so I don't like that. But I would just say objectively good advice, right? I can point to a statement and show how I'm going to add value besides knowing tax strategies, besides knowing how to leverage your position as a business owner, besides this or that investments. Those are real value add things that you can point to and quantify.
mm,
Investments are subjective, right? If you say this stock is good versus that stock is good, that's subjective. But what's not is that objective positioning the right way and consistency for families. That is tangible.
mm. Wow, well said. I think, to your point, most people, start their search for just about everything online, and there's been a huge surge over the last, a year or so of searches, even just on platforms like ChatGPT, right? And I think that's great. I mean, I think, it's important for people to start somewhere, right? But
Sure.
I think at the end of the day, once you really start getting into the nitty gritty of your personal story, of your personal needs, it's important to engage someone that has credibility. Okay. In our industry, there's plenty of people that say they're number one, right? You know, I don't know how that works, but perhaps there's tons of number ones, but it's okay to work with a number two. Okay. Get a referral from someone that's obviously that you trust, right? And then ask the right questions, right? Beyond just the comprehensive plan, right? Which is a common, term that's used in your space, right? Um, Maybe ask, okay, well, how does this work versus this, right? So I
Right.
think what you're saying is, most people are intimidated to meet people like yourself because they just don't know the right question to ask, right?
Sure.
And you also
And I
bring up,
would jump in on the plan just for a second because you
yeah,
said everyone talks about a plan as it's it's a rubber stamp aspect to it where running a financial plan for someone has value to it. Some people charge for plans, we don't. We purposely try to put goodwill at the upfront of a relationship. One, we don't have to take on clients that we don't align with and we think we can add value to. So we're just brutally honest. But number two is if you want to work with someone for 30 or 40 years, you have to put goodwill at the upfront of that relationship, right? And I'm just going to give you advice that you can walk away with. But ultimately, I would say 9 out of 10 individuals that go through that process, they say, wow, okay, he just gave us this advice for nothing. He really is trying to work with us for a long time, not, to the end of the month. Okay. Anyone can run a plan, but the real value add is in executing that over the next several decades. So it goes back to my point about asset allocation or trying to force someone into a product, or everything has to be a nail if you need to get someone across the finish line quickly, versus if you're trying to work with someone for 30 or 40 years, you don't care about the next 30 or 40 minutes in the same way of, I'm just going to be brutally honest, and this is what I would lay out for you, because the wealthier my clients are, the happier they are, the happier I am. There's no ambiguity as to what we want. So I think that's a real differentiator that I harp on. It's not just the simple fact of running a plan, it's and executing that plan.
Your philosophy in business has completely inspired me, right? And that's one of the reasons why I wanted you to come on here, because in our conversation, you used the philosophy of the 3 I's, which is the catalyst of everything that you've built here and the reason why you've gained momentum in your career. So can you maybe talk a little bit about that and share this with our listeners? Because I think this is super powerful, something that I think everyone should understand and learn.
Sure. I appreciate that. Well, first of all, shout out to my good friend, Paul Jaglowski, who got this or gave it to me, and he got it from someone else. The saying goes, and he was talking about developing a business. In Paul's case, he was in a startup. He's since successfully exited, and they're loving life down in North Carolina. But his expression that he gave me was, when you're building up a business originally, it's almost impossible. Restaurants fail, startups fail. The odds are truly against you. Okay. And then ultimately, if you can survive, then it's improbable that you are going to hit a certain number or develop a certain amount of skill. How long do restaurants stay open? How long do tech firms stay open when you're competing with some of the big boys? But ultimately, if you can just keep surviving, keep improving that skill set, success is inevitable. So it's impossible, improbable, inevitable. And that, besides, my number one life credo is keep your word is your bond. But the 3 I's, I think, embodies so much of, people want to know me as a person. That's it right there. Because it speaks to owning a business. It speaks to developing a skill. It speaks to relationships. It speaks to so many aspects that I truly, truly believe in my core. And it ties in nicely with investing, right? Which is, someone may be starting out now, or all their money's tied up in their business, and they think, oh, exit is impossible. Well, right now it may be, viewed that way statistically, but you just have to survive, keep improving, right? And then ultimately, it's just inevitable. It's just a matter of degree. When I was first developing my career, and I had these good mentors that I was trying to learn from, but ultimately there was that ceiling, right? But I was always trying to say, okay, well, someday, inevitably, I will become my own advisor. All right. But starting out, it's impossible. I had all my mentors tell me, do not go off on your own. It is statistically a bad idea to do that. And I always say this, they were right and I was right, because it was a bad idea. But I had enough backing and enough will that I was ready. I was really ready to go. So that when I had my own practice, could go off on my own, it wasn't impossible. It was unlikely at that point, but all these things started to come into place. It's skill, luck, timing, all these things. But I knew I could add value because I had done it in my previous firms when I was working with other advisors. And now I'm the one who's hiring. I'm the one who's expanding the team. And it's a very fortunate position to be in. And I count myself very lucky personally and professionally. But that mindset, those 3 I's, that is so much of my credo. And tying it into what I do is that if you think that you want to exit for a particular number, or we talk about goals, right? Not being able to work because you want to, not because you have to. It feels impossible right now. Well, it is impossible if you don't work on it, if you don't improve it, if you don't invest, if you don't save, if you don't do the right things, right? Have the right debt, not the wrong debt. Don't overlever yourself, okay? But if you take those little incremental steps, all of a sudden it'll become inevitable. Humans have a really hard time understanding compounding interest and exponential growth. But that's what we do. That's part of what we do as advisors. That's how we help our clients. But it's also a great mindset for life. I know you and I talk about, a lot of the same motivational speakers, and I've leaned on my buddy Paul. I've leaned on the speakers that I've heard before. But I think if you can have that drive and really intensely focus on the client and what are their real needs, how are you really going to add value, as opposed to how quickly can you get them to sign up, then a lot of that curve takes care of itself from their investment standpoint, from their goal standpoint, from their business standpoint. Everyone benefits from having that alignment.
Your success is inevitable for that reason, Matt. And, it's been a real treat, to have you on the podcast to share a little bit of your story, to share a little bit about, how you view, the liability side of the balance sheet, the asset side of the balance sheet, but ultimately how you view life, right? Impossible, improbable, and inevitable.